okay to start? Yeah, okay. Right, so good morning, everyone, and welcome back. I have the honor and the joy, really, of chairing this morning's session with Professor Anthony Anghie and of introducing Tony, who obviously needs no introduction, really, but Tony, who's been such an amazing mentor and such a good friend to all of us in TWAILR and the editorial collective, and to so many people really in the TWAIL community around the world. And when we wrote the introduction piece, when we started the TWAILR journal a few years ago, the title of the piece was a journal for a community. And I know Usha spoke yesterday about TWAIL as a movement and a network and a conspiracy and all these other things, but to the extent that TWAIL is a community, it's a community really because of people like Tony and James Gatty and so many others who've led the way with their generosity and the openness they've shown and the welcoming spirit really they've fostered to this community. And actually, when we were publishing that first issue of the journal, it almost went without saying between us that Tony would be the person that we would ask to write a foreword to launch the journal into the world. And it goes without saying, obviously, that he immediately obliged. I was just looking back at it this morning, and I noticed that Tony talked about James and some of the others as TWAIL stalwarts, which I think is a nice phrase or a nice euphemism, and certainly less ageist than some of the language that was being thrown around yesterday, which I'd just like to disassociate myself from for the record. But if you haven't read that little foreword that Tony wrote for the journal, it's worth doing so. It's a very short piece, but in Tony's typical way, it captures a lot and has some nice reflections and thoughts on what it means to be a scholar, on what publishing and what journals are for, really, and on how TWAIL can and should contribute to democratizing knowledge production and to creating spaces where, to create spaces that are more hospitable and accessible for scholars who are starting out. And I think for so many of us, really, it's impossible to overstate just how important and how invaluable Tony has been as a mentor over the years. The number of PhD examinations that he's done, the volume of reference letters that he's written, the amount of time he's taken to read drafts and give feedback in the most generous of ways, and certainly for myself and for many of us on the editorial collective, he's done that and a huge amount more. I was lucky enough to meet Tony quite early in the first few months of my PhD, and for some reason he took an interest and gave me a huge amount of guidance in small and big ways along the way and over the years since. And I was delighted he was able to come over to Ireland a couple of times in that time as well. And I think among your many intellectual passions, Tony, you've always had a curiosity or an interest in Irish history and Irish literature, and I got to bring him to see a fairly epic production of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot in the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, and we were just talking about it yesterday, and I was thinking about it and think about it in relation to another maybe less highbrow cultural reference. But there's this line that Tony said once, or maybe more than once, that a lot of people remember and have quoted him on, which was about to kind of illustrate the repressive kind of character of international law. He said that international law is like the Hotel California, in that you can check out, but you can never leave. And I think from thinking about it from the other side of the coin, maybe when we think about the emancipatory potential of international law, if it exists, there's also maybe a bit of kind of Beckett-like absurdity to that, in that international law is this kind of omnipresent thing that haunts us in always being there and in promising so much, but it's still not quite arriving just yet. And there's obviously structural and systemic reasons for that, and Tony's work on just how deeply entwined the history and the discipline of international law is with colonial power and with imperialism. I think that work stands alone really for what it did in turning the field on its head, really, in the late 90s and the early 2000s, at this really crucial juncture in in history, and kind of coming at the end, like after the so-called end of history and the start of the onset of global war on terror and the war on Iraq. And I think if it wasn't for people like Tony and a few others pushing back so strongly against the mainstream currents at the time, I think our discipline could look so much different and so much worse today. And I think that's, you know, that's one of the also one of the striking features about Tony's work. For all of the searing critique of power and injustice, it also is infused with this spirit of hope and possibility, in a sense that there are alternatives, and it's our task and our responsibility to conceptualize those alternatives, to contribute to movements and struggles and thinking to make them real in whatever ways we can. And so I'll hand over to Tony in a minute. I haven't really given you his bio as such, maybe following Suja's lead yesterday, but just to say, obviously, you know, his book on imperialism, sovereignty, and the making of international law is arguably, you know, the single most important text in not just in TWAIL, but in international law scholarship across the board in the last 30 or 40 years. Many or most of you will have read it already, and others no doubt will read it very soon. And I think, you know, the role of the Spanish conquest of these lands that we now call the Americas is obviously a central part of that story. And so I think it's particularly resonant to be hearing from Tony today here in Colombia, and also maybe to bring it up more up to speed, at least on some elements of the bio, that Tony's most recent piece that a lot of you will have also seen in the European Journal of International Law on rethinking international law, a third world retrospective, or a TWAIL retrospective. I think that would be another indispensable text for the coming years. And so apart from that and all of those other publications and contributions and fancy awards from prestigious scholarly associations, Tony's also well known to be a brilliant teacher in the classroom, someone who thinks deeply about pedagogy, who cares deeply about his students. He teaches at the National University of Singapore and at the University of Utah. He is the Secretary General, or he said hopefully soon to be ex-Secretary General of the Asian Society of International Law. And we're very happy and grateful that he's here with us today.
Well, thank you so much, John. I really have to say I feel very moved and overwhelmed by that extraordinarily over-generous introduction. I think I should say, I feel I shouldn't be here. When I was first invited by our wonderful TWAIL colleagues who've done this extraordinary job of organizing this TWAIL Academy, I said, I don't think I should be here, because I really feel that, you know, there is this complication with movements like TWAIL, which is that the elders keep hanging around. You know, it's a bit like this awkward uncle or whatever it is, you know, who keeps talking about how wonderful it is to see the younger generation, and yet won't leave. You know, you've been very kind, John, in terms of the terminology used, stalwarts, but the terminology I used all the way back in Singapore was old fogey. And I feel very much like that. When one of my colleagues read my European Journal piece in draft, he said, you know, it seems to me that you're writing that as a prelude to retirement. And he's quite right. I mean, I wrote that as an attempt to say to all of you, because I see all of you as the future. And one of the proudest things I feel about TWAIL, and of course, to me, you know, I'm so proud to be part of this network. One of the most impressive things about TWAIL is that I would like to think the next generation is in place, because one of the most difficult things of any type of intellectual movement is this whole question of continuity and succession. And my own observation, very crude, not scientific, is that one of the big problems these movements face in terms of the issue of succession is the old people just won't go away, right? So really, when I was, you know, so elders is a very, I'm happy to accept that term. It's better than old fogies. And it's a very TWAIL, you know, I really appreciate the very TWAIL approach to elders. Because in Western scholarship, the more traditional way of making a reputation for yourself is to kill the elders, right? That's what you do. You know, you find some prominent scholar and say, this prominent scholar is wrong in all the following 10 ways. And you start a debate, you start a controversy. And then, you know, it's a bit like these nature documentaries or whatever it is, you know. But it's one of the wonderful attributes of TWAIL that there is this kindness towards us, the elders, creaky knees and all, as James said. I didn't know quite how to frame this. But, you know, I really wanted to make it a discussion. I want to, because I feel the wonderful thing about this event is that we have the elders. James, I hope you don't mind me including you among those. Well, there are those of us who are, I suppose, the first generation TWAIL. And then there are people like, you know, the organizers of this conference, John, Usha, Laura, Sujit, Amma, I suppose the next generation, and then there are all of you. And I think what would be really interesting is to have a sort of intergenerational, if that is the word, type of conversation. And I feel we could just start that conversation on the basis of John's comments. But let me just say a few things about history and TWAIL. Just to throw some things out there, so we'll have something we can discuss. And then in terms of pedagogy, I'll try to connect some of the issues about history and TWAIL with pedagogy in terms of my experiences in the context of my work in Singapore. So in Singapore, I am involved in a project called Teaching and Researching International Law in Asia. Papawadi participated in that. So you can make your own comments on that, Kun Papawadi. I thought that might be kind of a way to open a discussion about pedagogy in the third world. Not that Singapore is the third world, but it's an interesting example of the third world in certain respects. Okay, history. So perhaps we could just start with some, history has been very important to me in my approach to international law. But I just want to suggest that it wasn't intended to be that way. I did not intend to be a historian of international law, although that is the way in which I am often perceived. So the question is, why did I find myself turning to history? And here we can think about history and international law in several modes. So one thing I would say is, well, history is inescapable in international law. If you think of so many of the disputes that go before the International Court of Justice, so many of those disputes involve huge historical research. I spent quite a lot of time at The Hague because my mentor, my hero, well, I have several heroes, but one of my, I suppose, a very important hero to me was my teacher, Judge Christopher Veeramantri, and he was a judge at the ICJ. And I spent a lot of time at The Hague with him. So it was really interesting to see the volumes and volumes of historical materials that he had to go through in order to, decide, for example, boundary disputes. James wrote this wonderful article about Kwasikulu. So another dispute, it's all about basically what we might regard as historical materials, the treaties usually between European powers in Africa, or in the case of Priyaviha, the whole history of, France in Indochina. So a huge number of these disputes involve studying these materials. I'm sure it is also true of all the different territorial and maritime disputes that take place in Latin America. You have to go through all those materials. So that's one way in which history is important. And it's a way in which the conventional discipline accepts almost without thinking that, of course, history is important. So a second way in which history is important is, well, we are lawyers and law is built on precedent, this thing called precedent. And so then we have history being given a different character where there are certain events, certain practices that somehow are given the status of law. And I think as TWAIL scholars, the interesting question we should ask is, who are the actors in terms of these particular incidents that create law? So, we keep looking back to precedents. And, if we read even the most conventional international judgments with a view to that idea, we could ask the critical question of, whose actions create state practice. And, we often find, for example, in the Western Sahara case, a sort of mention of non-European entities. And it's very interesting to just study closely the way in which those non-European entities are represented within the discipline, and whether those non-European entities have any status at all. And then, of course, whether those non-European entities and their actions what is the lens, what is the framework that is being used to examine those non-European entities? Because it is the framework that is really important. So you could say the conventional discipline thinks of history in those ways. Then another way in which we might think about history is most textbooks don't really spend much time at the beginning on delving into the question of history. I mean, Ian Brownlee's brilliant, outstanding textbook has nothing about history. It just says, we begin with sources. And textbooks sometimes have 4 or 5 pages, a sort of rough sketch from, 1648 to the present, a bit of a reference to, well, there was always all these other practices, but, what we should focus on is what happened from 1648 onwards. So then why did I turn to history? It was partly because I was involved in international litigation. And that required me to do a huge amount of historical research just to find out what happened, what the relevant law was at that particular time. Now, that takes me to another theme in terms of why history is important. And it is important because of the principle of intertemporal law, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, and which is now becoming more and more important when we look at questions of reparations and so forth. So the basic principle of intertemporal law is you can only assess the legality of an action in terms of the law existing at the time. So, for example, the argument is being made that slavery was not internationally illegal because during the time of the practice of slavery, there was no principle of international law which prohibited slavery or which said that slavery was illegal. And this is a huge issue in the whole debate about reparations. Now, of course, that leads us to ask other questions, which is, whose law are we talking about? And that's why we have to do this, all this further research. So third world international lawyers, such as R.P. Anand, had another reason for examining history, and that also applied to me, which is the feeling that if we look at the conventional histories to the extent that they existed, basically those conventional histories regarded the non-European world as pretty much irrelevant. It was exotic, it was interesting. There were certain ideas that, any educated person should be familiar with. It would be good to learn something about Islam. It would be good to learn something about Buddhism, for instance, or Hinduism. It's an interesting body of ideas, but they're not really relevant to the discipline proper. And furthermore, of course, this idea that only certain states, certain societies were civilized was something that really had a very profound impact on everybody in the non-European world. It is not a happy thing to be called uncivilized, especially if certain legal consequences follow. Because as we know from the 19th century, if you are uncivilized, then you are not fully sovereign. So, of course, as many scholars here have pointed out, this was what really became the target of so many efforts by non-European countries to say we are civilized too. And in order to prove that we are civilized, we had to return to our history and say we too have some concept of treaties. We too have some ideas of good governance. We too have certain ideas of human dignity. And of course, the interesting thing is historically, all this focused on the concept of race. So those of you who might be interested in this issue, race became the central focus. And so non-European countries wanted to establish the principle of racial equality. And, Japan fought for this principle in the League of Nations. And if you look at the Bandung text of 1955, race is a central issue there. So again, that was a reason why the first generation of scholars from TWAIL focused on history. I suppose what I found through my historical studies was another set of concepts, or a sort of explanation for the phenomenon that our generation of TWAIL scholars was trying to understand, which is, why did the new international economic order fail? Now, here was a massive, ambitious project. Nicholas was speaking about different aspects of it. Here was a massive, ambitious project, and this massive, ambitious project, which was supported by, I would say, 80% of the world's population and 80% of the world's states, if not more, 90%. Why did that fail? What did that failure tell us about the jurisprudence of international law? And here, I would say the new international economic order failed clearly for political reasons, but there were also, what struck me was there were really powerful legal arguments that were made to defeat the new international economic order. And this resonated with an experience I had in doing the research for this litigation. And it was a litigation involving basically colonial reparations. And what struck me was this fascinating paradox in a way, which is that it seems that reparations were most obviously required under any legal system in these circumstances. A country has been exploited, its people have been devastated, its environment has been destroyed. Surely any system of law would suggest that the people who have suffered all this should be paid reparations. But international law did not allow it. And I was fascinated. How was it that on one hand, international law has a whole developed set of ideas about compensation for the destruction of property, and yet this entire country, which has been devastated, can't make a claim? So that's what really drove my particular interest in understanding how could this happen? Because it is one of the fundamental principles of international law, or major themes of international law, that it is all about the protection of property. I would say that is the animating theme of international law, the protection of property. And yet, those ideas relating to the protection of property developed at the same time that non-European peoples were being utterly dispossessed. So how was it this paradox that property was being elaborated, protected in all these very sophisticated ways on one hand, but if you're non-European, your entire country could be taken from you? So I felt history had to provide the answers, or that's where I started looking. So in this context, I would say, history then struck me as being much more important. So why is history much more important? Because history is theory. In other words, what I mean by saying that history is theory is that it is out of historical circumstances that great scholars construct their theories, because they want to explain in more elaborate and sophisticated terms what it is we're studying. So the great Greek historian Thucydides, when he wrote the Peloponnesian Wars, was trying to say, what are the fundamental principles that govern the way in which this war has unfolded? And he was extraordinarily ambitious. He said, I'm writing a history for all time. What I am writing is going to identify the fundamental principles of law, of war and law. And in many ways, he has been remarkably successful, because when we look at, the whole issue of China and the United States, that's being examined through the framework created by Thucydides in terms of rising powers and how established powers respond to rising powers. So certain ideas then they become universal. Can we see then how certain local incidents, when they are subject to the theorizing of great scholars like Grotius or Thucydides, or I should mention another great scholar, his name is Kautilya. He wrote the Arthashastra. Perhaps we're not so familiar with this, but it is a great work of Indian statecraft. And there too, it's like, these are the fundamental principles of statecraft. And, so can we see that out of that particular experience, the argument is, how can we generalize? How can we find the underlying principles? So then the question is, whose history do we focus on, right? And of course, in terms of our discipline, we have always focused on 1648, and that is the Peace of Westphalia. And the Peace of Westphalia presents to us a certain set of issues which are regarded as the fundamental issue of international law. And that issue is, how is law created among equal and sovereign states? So those of you who look to the jurisprudence of international law have said, well, how is law to be created among equal and sovereign states? And the argument is, law cannot be created effectively among equal and sovereign states, because for an effective system of law to be established, we need sanctions. And sanctions can only be established if there is an overarching sovereign, a central sovereign, a Hobbesian sovereign, Thomas Hobbes being a model here. Now, so here, what I would say is, the problem with that is the issue of equal and sovereign states. If we look at history through that paradigm, we can't account for the experience of the non-European world, because the experience of the non-European world was, we are not sovereign. That has been the experience of the non-European world. So can we see then that history is theory? 1648 has created this theory, and it has shaped and fashioned the way in which all international lawyers, I would say, have examined the discipline. And all the great international lawyers feel they have to provide some sort of answer to this question. So if we look at the work of, great work of Sir Hersch Lauterpacht or Thomas Frank, I would say that in different ways, they're trying to answer that question. So it's very interesting then, because it leaves out the non-European world. We have no place in this system. So then I thought, well, what is an alternative vocabulary that we need in order to explore our experience coming from the non-European world? So that's what I mean by saying history is theory. The second thing I would say here is, history is tradition. In other words, it creates a set of norms. It creates a set of ideas about what the discipline of international law is. And for us, more personally, I would almost say history is identity. And I would say, this is something that, we understand almost intuitively. History is identity. I think all of us want to know where we come from. There are massive industries which trace genealogies, right? We want to know where we come from in order to know who we are and what we should be doing and how we should be projecting into the future, how we should see ourselves. So then you can see how with this tradition and identity, at a personal level, so there's the whole tradition of international law, that we can talk about in institutional terms. We can think of the Institute of International Law. I'm afraid to pronounce it in French, which is the Institut du Droit. So that's another reason I'm not a proper international lawyer. I don't speak French. And one of my European colleagues said, "You don't speak French? But how can you be an international lawyer?" So then I said, yes, and that's exactly why I just see myself as a student of international law. And I am condemned to suffer that fate, I think, for the rest of my life, because I think maybe at this stage, if I'm learning a new language, it probably should be Chinese. So we have all those traditions, like the Institute, we have the American Society of International Law. Here in Latin America, you have the wonderful work being done by Latin American scholars on all the different institutions created here, the people who established them and so forth. The Indian Society of International Law. So all these traditions, you could say, but these are all European, and there's a hierarchy. I would say in terms of these institutions, the Institut du Droit still holds, a pride of place, as it were. And, it is the understandable ambition of anyone who enters the field to be part of this very distinguished, and they are very distinguished and brilliant community of a different sort of scholars, wherever we come from. And then there's identity, which is how do I see myself in terms of international law? How do I see myself as a woman, as a person of color, as a queer person? Can I play a role in international law? How can I make a career in international law? So we can see how history filters through in all those different ways. From the macro, history creates for us the language through which we understand ourselves and our discipline and who we are and what we can do within the discipline. Now, here, post-colonial studies, and I had studied post-colonialism long before I'd studied international law, and that was a good thing. It was a good thing because post-colonialism was so much more, you could say, insightful and so much more developed and so much more, radical in looking at this whole phenomenon of history. And some of you might be familiar, I mean, many wonderful post-colonial scholars, Gayatri Spivak, a difficult read, but sometimes worth it, if you can get through it. Partha Chatterjee, very accessible to me anyway, and Deepesh Chakrabarty, because Chakrabarty made the very interesting point that is now almost commonplace, which is we are looking at our own reality through a set of ideas that have been constructed for us by the West. So similarly, applying that idea to international law, we are looking at our own history, trying to meet the criteria that have been established by the West. And so I think one of the major themes of TWAIL is how do we understand our own history in our own terms? And how can we confidently present that history? What happens when we say, actually, you might think of international law in this way, but this is how we have experienced it. And then how do we create a language from our own experience to challenge the universalizing, the monopolizing, the hegemonic discourse that has been established over 500 years? How do we do that? And I think it becomes a crucial political issue because, as John points out, we need alternatives. I mean, isn't it interesting, with the heat waves and everything else? I mean, here we are, you could say we're heading inevitably towards complete destruction as far as I can see. And the system of international law that is in place is surely complicit with that. We need alternatives. And I think the world is waking up to the fact that we need alternatives. And so this is where an ability to present different visions, whether it is the vision of indigenous peoples or feminist visions. And now there's this wonderful scholarship on queer international law, all those different visions. It's not necessarily that these visions provide easy solutions, but at least they present alternatives that we have to seriously consider in a situation where we've tried and tried. And I would say the situation is not just that existing ideas or bad ideas are leading to this problem. To me, it seems even worse. It seems to me that the bad ideas are becoming even more powerful in many respects. So it's not a case of equilibrium. I mean, James gave this wonderful presentation on foreign investment. So you can see there the dynamic where they say, oh, here's a problem, and we're going to do something serious about this, and UNCITRAL is involved in this, and various other institutions are involved in this. And in fact, the proposed solution could, as James said, simply streamline the situation rather than address the core problems. And similarly with the environment, I mean, all the wonderful work that Usha and her colleagues have been doing. So that's why we need alternatives. That's why history is important. And I just thought, some of these comments might make more sense in the afternoon. Again, I'm speaking far too much. I don't know, I should have just said no. Okay, right. Why am I blaming them? I should have just said no, but I'm speaking in the afternoon as well on the rights of aliens. And that'll give you perhaps another glimpse of how I use history to explore a particular theme. But in terms of this alternative, 1648 is the moment that has generated the theory that has dominated our discipline. And many of the institutions that have been so powerful for our discipline. Has this always been up here? Oh, okay, great. I was going to get to that. So I thought, how could we formulate a different perspective? One that would incorporate the non-European world. Could somebody read this in, well, it should be read properly in Spanish. And there are so many Spanish speakers here, but this is the English translation. I should have had it in the original Spanish. This is the English translation. You know, sir, as I know that you will be pleased at the great victory with which our Lord has crowned my voyage, I write this to you from which you learn how in 33 days I passed the Canary Island to the Indies with the fleet of the most illustrious king and queen our sovereigns gave to me. Bit of a typo. The fleet that the most illustrious king and queen our sovereigns gave to me. And there I found very many islands filled with people, innumerable. And of them all, I have taken possession. For their highnesses, by proclamation made, and with the royal standard unfurled. And no opposition was offered to me. To the first island which I found, I gave the name San Salvador, in remembrance of the divine majesty who has marvelously bestowed all this. The Indians call it Guanahani. To the second, I gave the name Isla de, somebody in Spanish, the proper. Thank you. To the third, to the fourth, to the fifth. And so to each one, I gave a new name. And this, of course, is Columbus. So all I'm trying to suggest is in terms of where do we find a different vocabulary, rather than think of 1648, let's think of 1492, this moment. By the way, where does the name Colombia come from? Oh, okay, so this is quite appropriate then. Colombia, you're finding out about the origins of, you could say, the TWAIL version of the origins of Colombia. So what I want to suggest is there's a whole alternative theoretical framework that can be found in this one passage. No, so we can see the medieval world, isn't it? The great victory with which our Lord has crowned my voyage. You know, a reference to the sovereigns who have sponsored this great voyage, and how in 33 days, and of course the religious dimension, our Lord, you know, so everything is divinely sanctioned, divinely ordained. I passed the Canary Islands, the last familiar landfall to this particular voyager, to the Indies. Okay, so the idea was we have to find a sea route to the Indies, to the countries we now know as Indonesia and China and so on. And there I found very many islands filled with people innumerable. He finds islands, he finds people. What is the first thing he does? He takes possession. This is a rather inhospitable way, I mean, of arriving in a new country, don't you think? So can you see the property instinct? The first thing you have to do is you have to take possession. You don't know where you are. You don't know who these people are. And in fact, you think you're in the Indies, but you're not. There's an entire continent, you know, in the way. The first instinct is to take possession. Can we see that? And then he realizes in order to take possession is many things, but it has most powerfully a legal dimension. You can't take possession unless you can justify such a claim legally, correct? Possession is a legal concept above all. You can't claim to possess something unless you can make some kind of claim to say, this is how I establish my title, correct? So you can see how law comes into the picture, because what does he do? For the highnesses, by proclamation made and by royal standard unfurled. So you can see there's a ceremony where he's trying to give a legal character to what he has just done. Can we see that? And no opposition was offered to me. So you can imagine the situation. So here he is, you know, standard unfurled. He makes a proclamation. Mama me rata Lankawata dang sambandha karanawa. ඔයගොල්ලන්ට ප්‍රශ්නයක් තියෙනවද? නෑ නේ. හරි. මේ රට දැන් ලංකාවට තමයි අයිති. Okay, I've just taken possession of all of you on behalf of Sri Lanka. Okay. So, and no opposition was offered to me. But can we see the other dynamic, which is he claims to give the natives the opportunity to speak. Can we see that? Have you got any problem? right? Or Prashnakti, another, right? So can we see how he claims to incorporate them? And now there's a huge international law problem here, which is the problem simply of jurisdiction. It's like, it's almost like two entirely incommensurate societies meeting each other. What is the law that governs relations between them? It's a very legal problem. Can we see that issue? Supposing there were Martians to land here, what is the law that operates? Now we would say territorial sovereignty, Earth law, right? But here, he's the Martian claiming that Martian law is applicable to the Earth. Can we see that? But he's got to try and make this convincing. So what he tries to say is, basically, it is consent. No opposition was offered to me. Can we see that? So he has to give them the opportunity to speak. But then he speaks for them. Can we see that double dynamic just in those few lines? But then can you see what happens when he recognizes that they have speech? They called it Guanahani. And what does he do? He renames them. Can we see that? So can we see the whole process of erasure taking place right there? So my argument is, so much of TWAIL can be extracted from these like 10 lines. Because this suggests an alternative theoretical perspective. So we do see property, we do see sovereignty, but here we see sovereignty in the context not of, oh, wonderful European sovereignty being extended out to these barbaric non-European people. It is sovereignty, people being stripped of their sovereignty. Can we see that? That is what is happening here. So that's why I would say so many of the TWAIL themes can be found just in this. And if we engage in the practice of what are the fundamental principles, what are the fundamental questions, those are the TWAIL questions. How are non-European people deprived of their voice? How are non-European people deprived of their sovereignty? And you can see it's part of a very elaborate structure that is already in place, isn't it? So this is one suggestion about history and how we might find alternative principles to enable non-European peoples to speak. And that has been one of the major, I suppose, TWAIL preoccupations. Now, I spent far too much time on this. I'll quickly switch to pedagogy, if I can. Entirely different. This is all institutional. Could I get to the second? The other, which is TWAIL. Yeah, TWAIL. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me just show that final picture, the one before. Yeah. Okay, this. Now, so what I'm interested in is how this particular perspective shapes also visually, because this is, I don't know who drew this, but it's pretty typical of the portraits of Columbus's arrival. So what's interesting about this perspective is you can see it is suggested it's the perspective of the natives looking at the arrival of the Europeans. Can we see that? And we can see the Europeans in all their splendor, the natives bowing down, as they properly should, because after all, this is divinely ordained. And, this is the great superior civilization whose superiority could be instantly recognized. But can we see it is presented as the natives' perspective, but it is in fact the European perspective of the natives. Can we see? So it's the same erasure that we see linguistically performed in that passage. Can we see that? So in terms of this whole question of, so in other words, this structure of erasure is to be found in all aspects of European culture. Linguistically, philosophically, historically, visually, in the arts. I mean, it's a wonderful and interesting experience to go to the great European museums, the Rijksmuseum or the Kunsthaus in Austria, which I recently went to, to see the way in which these encounters are represented. And then occasionally, stunningly, I saw this about a month ago, this portrait by Titian. Suddenly you see there's a very rich merchant in all his splendor, and then there's a black boy in the corner. And suddenly I realized Titian is suggesting this is how he made his money. Slavery, So there are moments of that kind of, and I don't know what they intended to do that, but there are moments where the reality, this other reality emerges in some respect. So you can look at the history of art. Usha, you might give a TWAIL course on art and imperialism. Okay, now teaching. So we're going from Columbus to. So the question I would ask you is: think of the history of your own country and the moment that Europe arrived in your own country, and say international law begins at this moment, right? Whichever country you are, because every country has every non-European country, I should say, every non-European country has some kind of treaty, some type of event, which legally, you could say, inaugurates the existence of that country within European civilization. Think of that one moment, like in Sri Lanka, there's a famous treaty in 1815 that was signed between the Kandyan chiefs and Britain. And think of that moment and then say, do what we have done already with Columbus. Take that moment and think, how do I represent this moment from the perspective of the people, the non-European people, and what can we learn? Can you elaborate a set of principles in that regard? So, Colombia might say, international law begins in X in 1532 or whatever it is your history is. Can we see that and see where you go? Okay, teaching and researching international law. So this is an institutional project, but it is a project which connects with what I perceive is becoming quite prominent now, which is how do we teach international law? This was not a question that was, can you, okay, I've got rid of the microphone. Do I need the microphone? You want the microphone? Okay. So teaching and researching international law. No, so this is suddenly an issue that has become prominent in the West. And in many respects, I would suggest it's because of, am I being immodest here? It is because of efforts of what TWAIL scholars have been doing. We've been now for 25 years pointing to how inadequate the conventional approach is. And now that, you could say, that criticism, I think, has been filtering to the question of, well, if it is inadequate, how should we teach international law? But, and so now it's interesting, now the British Institute had a seminar recently. So suddenly it's become an in thing. And TWAIL scholars would say, well, actually, we've been at this for the last, 60 years. And there's evidence for this, not because people wanted to be TWAIL scholars in non-European countries, but in Singapore, for example, they said, well, we're a new nation. How do we find our way in the world of international law? What do our students need to understand? How can we train the people who are going to negotiate these treaties and represent us in international institutions? So in Singapore in 1964, there was a major conference about this issue. And the people who attended the conference included, Myers McDougall, Boutros Ghali, a large number of very prominent scholars from all over the world. So this question about what should we teach, how should we teach it, should it be taught as part of international relations, that was a very real question to these universities, just as they were being established in the newly independent states. Can we see that issue? Now, of course, it wasn't presented in a critical way, but still there was this puzzle of how does all these European ideas, what should we be doing with them? So in Singapore, I would claim there has been this, and what I put up here, do I click this? In 1964, there's a roundtable on teaching international law and foreign relations. And there's a whole report, and you can find that report on the TWAILR website. And you can see all the different scholars who attended and their different views about, and some of them are really interesting and very current in terms of the teaching of international law. So in Singapore, there's been a tradition of a number of conferences held on the teaching of international law. How should Singapore and its neighbors more broadly, because that roundtable was global, deal with this issue. So there's a conference in 2001, proceedings published in the Singapore Journal of International Law. And then I organized the conference in Singapore in 2018. 2018 was a very stressful year for me because this conference took place shortly before the TWAIL conference. But I had wonderful colleagues in Singapore. I mean, the efficiency and dedication of the people in Singapore, that they cannot be faulted for. Some of you might remember Jaya, who was so important for this. And the core issues we looked at. Here, our ambition was not to be critical. It was just the question of, or not necessarily critical, that it wasn't a TWAIL event. That was held a couple of weeks later, and many of you were there. I'm glad to say it. But this was more like, how can we, what are the concerns of junior faculty, especially in Asian countries? What are the challenges they face? And how can we institutionally establish a set of programs that might help them address these challenges? So then we sent out a very long questionnaire to find out issues such as, what are the materials that you use? Like, what are the textbooks? Anyone want to guess which the most popular textbook was among Asian countries? Malcolm Shaw. So can we see, Chakrabarty's same argument? Chakrabarty is saying, we are looking at our own history through a Western lens. And Shaw is a very elaborate, extensive textbook. It is, I would say, it is brilliant in its own way. Okay, it's a bit dense to me, but I used Shaw in a secondary way, in the sense that when I need a bit more detail. Creation of syllabuses and course outlines. Here again, a very practical issue. What do you include in your syllabus? And international law is expanding all the time. And what are the core things you can teach? So then, effective teaching techniques. So this was before COVID, but still there's the question of, we have all these technological resources. And of course, the students have a different set of expectations and a different way of learning. Now, how do we adapt to all that? And then challenges in researching, writing, and publication. So one of the most interesting things we found in our questionnaire was, we asked the question, what is most important for your progress professionally? Is it your teaching or your research? And overwhelmingly, it was research. But for Asian countries, I can't remember the precise percentage, but it was pretty clear-cut, maybe 60-40, something like that. But in Asian countries, it's a real complication, because in Sri Lanka, for example, there's very little emphasis on research and writing. The emphasis was much more on teaching and perhaps advising the government, in certain circumstances. So in many Asian countries, through no fault of anybody's, there's this problem about research and writing not being a part of the culture of the institution. And yet I found out, and this is where my colleague, our friend Shahab, who's taught in Bangladesh, what he said was, now education ministries are developing all these criteria, and they are global criteria, and I'm not sure where they come from. But now you have these Asian scholars in Asia who are in this situation where research and writing has not been a part of their culture, suddenly being told, in order to be promoted, you have to publish, and you have to publish in this vague thing, international journals. It's not good enough to publish in your local journal. What is an international journal? So Shahab has done some really interesting work in terms of how this became part of the whole Bangladeshi educational system. And now it is crushing, I would suggest, Asian universities. Because, very simple, for example, now suddenly to get promoted to professor, you have to have all these international publications, but you haven't grown up in a culture where this has become a major criterion. So a colleague in an Asian university was telling me, we're going to have problems because no one's being promoted to professor, and yet there are certain committees that require the presence of a professor to act as chair. Can we see the complications that arise? So then the question is, what can TWAILR do about this? So we compiled a whole project report about all this. It's all on the TWAILR website, and I'll provide you with the details. And then what we did was we went to particular countries. TWAILR on the road, we called ourselves. So we had a major conference in Singapore. Then we went from country to country. I basically myself, in collaboration with, so I would, colleagues in Sri Lanka, I would say, and that seemed a bit nepotistic. I mean, Sri Lanka isn't part of ASEAN. Our first focus should have been on ASEAN countries. But we did TWAILR Thailand. No, okay, let me talk about TWAILR Thailand. So I had a colleague in Thailand, Kun Pawat, and I said, Pawat, are you interested in doing this? And I would say, here are the things we can do. Do you want to focus on teaching? Do you want to focus on research and writing? So we tried to have something that combined all these things, a bit like this TWAIL Academy, where we have general lectures, but then also workshops. And I would say, here's the menu, what you all want, and we would collaborate with the local scholars, and they would give presentations, and then we would try to contribute. And for example, I would hold a whole session on writing an abstract. Just writing an abstract. Now, why is writing an abstract important? So as I suggested in the workshop, it's a great way of disciplining yourself. Because if you have an argument, you should be able to present that argument in 400 words at most, if not 300 words. So then I would go through different abstracts and say, what's good about this abstract? What's bad about this abstract? So scholars, the participants would develop a sense of what is a good abstract about. And now we have ChatGPT. But I think that's not a good, it depends on the reader, right? I think ChatGPT can write a very good generic abstract. But why is an abstract important? It's important for you to, in order to discipline yourself in writing your article, because it's like the crucial question about any article is, what is your argument? What is it that you are saying that is new? In your abstract, you have to show that you understand the literature, and this is as far as the literature goes. This is what you are saying. This is why what you say is important or different. Now, that's a very high threshold. The other thing I want to tell people is there is not just one way of writing an article. Not every article can be like a new theory of international law, right? But you can make important contributions, but you've got to be clear what that contribution is. Okay. So the other thing I found in many Asian countries was the absence of theory. And the complication is that for many journals, what is really attractive about an article is its theoretical dimension. Can we see that? In other words, being able to locate your particular article in the context of some broader theoretical innovation. I mean, that's one type of article, but you still, my claim would be that no matter what type of scholar you are, and I emphasize there are lots of different types of scholarship. Okay, it's not the case that you only would do theoretical scholarship or historical scholarship. In fact, in many Asian countries, most of our participants felt that they had to write something about their own country and make a contribution to understanding a particular problem in their own country. Now, the complication with that for international publication is, well, the argument is, but what's the international dimension? Why would this be of interest to somebody in, if you're somebody in Malaysia writing about a Malaysian problem, why would this be of interest to somebody in Colombia, right? So that's where the theory comes in, where you say this problem represents a broader issue. And it is that broader issue that connects you with a broad audience. Can we see that? So those are the types of things we did in workshops. And we went from country to country. Is this like the civilizing mission? I don't know. No. So I'm worried about that. I'd like to think I collaborate, that I'm not Columbus, that I actually engage with what the natives have to say, and that they shape the program. But can we see that, well, this whole thing is being driven by rankings. I don't know what particular encounter you've had, but so many of the scholars I meet in Asia say, we have to improve our rankings. And Singapore is doing very well. It's like the 10th ranked law school in the world. Well, anyway, I guess we would be happy to grasp that. But in Singapore, it's a problem because it's like, why only number 10? Like, you've got to be number 5, right? So it's like, it's endless, right? But we are requested by colleagues from other universities, like, what's your secret? Because rankings drive so many things, and it filters through to the scholars, to all of us. And more particularly, I'm sorry to say, all of you, because as I said, I'm heading towards retirement, leaving everything in your hands. So those are just some of the things that we did. as I said, different universities had different requests about what they want to discuss. And of course, we learned so much. And I've been really inspired by the scholars and teachers I've met in these countries, because of course, the crucial problem they face is resources as well. Resources in terms of time, they teach for 30 hours a week or something like that. And then resources in terms of just, we take it for granted that students have computers. I was so touched when I met a young teacher in Sri Lanka, and she was talking about how she devises her course around the use of phones. Her students don't have computers, but they have phones. So she tries to devise her course in a way that they can consult their phones to actually learn the subject. Right? So that's innovation, that's TWAIL, in a very profound way. So those are just, I've already spent more time than I wanted to. So here, these are just, okay, all this is available on the TWAILR website, because after every workshop, we produce a report. So the title and report is a bit held up, but it's going to come out. We're pretty short staff. And this is why I want to be ex-secretary general, because then I can focus on something like this, which means much more to me at this point of time. Those are the issues I just want to raise in terms of pedagogy. Okay, we've got 20 minutes. I'll keep. Oh no, one more final slide. Does anyone recognize this? It's nice. So for the conference in Singapore, I wanted to make it international. So I invited people from our colleagues from Africa, colleagues from Latin America, and I should also mention we did what I consider to be a wonderful blog book or whatever it's called. That was James's suggestion, because I said, James, you've got this report, and would it be of interest to African scholars and teachers? And James said, why don't we get a collection of blogs about this? So people from all parts of the world would read the report and then write a blog about different aspects of international law. So I think James has an Afronomics blog. So what I'm trying to suggest is, again, I'd like to think that it is we, the TWAILers, who've taken initiative with this. And that I think what we need is, politically, a coalition of the global south is proving to be difficult in these circumstances, politically. The coalition that led to the new international economic order can't easily be recreated. But we can create a coalition of teachers. That's all of you. That's within your power right now. I feel, this is another way of coming at this major problem. We don't have to have the political power to bring about change. I usually think in a very easy way. There are many TWAIL scholars who are making efforts to bring about political change. But it is a tough task. And how do we reform the international debt regime? Well, James is working on it, so we can be assured about that. But this is something we can do right now in our actual work. Can we see this? Create a coalition of teachers of international law and keep in contact with each other and change the way we think about the discipline. Okay, let me keep quiet now. Questions?